Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She'd been in the room the whole time, invisible among the uniforms, the patches, the noise of men who'd spent their careers being heard. But as the last echo of the shot faded across the Georgia woods, silence filled the observation bay like judgment. 12 elite shooters had missed. 12 trained marksmen from the Army's best units, all defeated by a plate of steel no larger than a satellite dish, 2.5 kilometers away. And in that silence, a single voice broke through. "Any real sharpshooters here?" Major General Hayes asked, his tone dripping with a kind of disappointment that felt heavier than anger, or just weekend warriors pretending. He didn't need to raise his voice. Authority carried through fatigue, through pride, through the sting of 12 failures. Around him stood the finest snipers the U.S. military had to offer: Delta operators, SEALs, Marine Scout snipers, Air Force JTACs, each one a name whispered with respect in their own circles. Yet in that moment, every one of them looked away. The general's question hung in the humid air, unanswered. In the far corner of the room, kneeling by a crate of ammunition, a woman paused her work. She had been invisible all morning, moving with quiet precision, checking lot numbers, labeling boxes, adjusting her clipboard. Her name tag read Kellerman, V. She wasn't supposed to be here as a shooter. She was logistics, supply. The kind of soldier everyone forgets is even in the room until the ammo runs dry. But when the 12th shot missed, when another puff of dust bloomed harmlessly short of the distant target, something in her shifted. She put down the clipboard. And without really thinking, she stood up. "Sir," her voice carried just enough to be heard over the murmurs, "request permission to attempt the shot." Every head turned. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then the laughter started, quiet at first, then louder. "Supply wants a turn now," one of the operators smirked. "Next, maybe the cooks can try." "Sergeant," the operations sergeant major said, tone like a warning, "this is a marksmanship evaluation, not a familiarization range." But then something unexpected happened. The Australian instructor, a tall, weathered man with eyes that had seen the Kandahar sun, went pale. His hand froze mid-motion. He leaned toward the general and whispered something too low for the rest to hear. General Hayes frowned. "What did you just say?" "That's Kellerman, sir," the instructor said quietly. "Kandahar 2019. If half of what I heard's true, you'll want to let her shoot." A new silence fell over the group, different this time. The mocking tone evaporated. People who hadn't even looked her way now studied her as if seeing a ghost. The ghost of Kandahar. That was the name the Australians had given her years ago. A rumor passed between units, the story of a shot taken in a dust storm, 2,247 meters, with a borrowed rifle, saving a patrol no one remembered by name. No record, no medal, no witness statement in any official file, but the men who'd seen it swore it happened. Now that ghost was standing here in the flesh, quiet, calm, almost reluctant, waiting for permission. General Hayes' gaze met hers. There was curiosity there and something else, the faint flicker of respect. "Sergeant Kellerman," he said finally, "you have 3 attempts. Range control log this as an authorized demonstration. I'll sign the paperwork." The laughter stopped. Kellerman nodded once. "Yes, sir." She moved with quiet certainty, not the showy confidence of someone trying to prove herself, but the deliberate precision of someone who'd already done it 1,000 times in silence. She walked to the rifle, the Barrett MRAD chambered in .338 Norma Magnum, a machine built for extremes. It rested on its bipod like an animal ready to kick. The barrel was still warm from the last shooter's frustration. Before taking position, she asked for permission to inspect the weapon. Some rolled their eyes. She ignored them. She ran a fingertip along the bolt face, checked the scope mount for microshift, tapped the barrel once, listening for harmonics. Then she did something no one else had thought to do: she checked the air. She borrowed a kestrel meter from one of the instructors, took readings at 3 points, and then quietly requested access to the last hour's weather balloon data. Someone laughed again, nervously this time. But she wasn't guessing, she was reading the air. There was an inversion layer, she realized, a thin band of warm air about 1,200 meters out, distorting optics and dragging rounds down. Everyone had trusted their computers. None had noticed nature lying to them. She marked notes by hand on a small card, recalculated her firing solution manually, barometric pressure, temperature, density, altitude. The kind of math that separates a shooter from a marksman. Master Sergeant Chen, the lead instructor, glanced over her shoulder. His skepticism softened into something resembling admiration. When she looked up, he nodded slightly. "Good call," he murmured. Kellerman didn't answer. She was already building her shooting position, pressing her body into the earth, aligning spine to barrel, breath to rhythm. Her mind emptied not of thought but of noise. In the glass of her scope, the target shimmered like a ghost, heat mirage dancing across the field. The range, 2,447 meters, pushed the cartridge near its limit. The bullet would spend more than 3 seconds in flight. 3 seconds, long enough to live a lifetime between trigger squeeze and impact. She slowed her breathing, found the pause between inhale and exhale, that single moment her grandfather had called the stillness. Her grandfather, Eugene Kellerman, Korean War sniper, the man who raised her on a Montana cattle ranch, who taught her that a rifle wasn't a weapon, it was a truth test. That patience was stronger than anger, and invisibility was its own kind of power. He used to tell her, "The world doesn't always see you, kid. That's fine. The bullet doesn't need to." She thought of him now, of his weathered hands guiding hers over a rifle stock, of his calm voice saying, "Breathe when others panic." The spotter gave the all-clear. Range is hot. Kellerman's finger settled on the trigger. First shot, deliberate miss. She sent it high and right, using it as a probe. The round cracked the air and vanished into distance. Dust bloomed far beyond the plate. 4 feet right, too high, the spotter called. She nodded, adjusted. The mirage told her more than any number. The inversion was stronger than she'd guessed, bending light, lying about distance. Second shot. She dialed 0.2 mils left, a hair lower. Waited, exhaled, squeezed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like a heartbeat. 3 seconds, silence. A puff of dust appeared, 1 foot left, half a foot low. Close enough that the room's laughter turned into stunned focus. People stood now, watching, waiting. General Hayes said nothing. His arms were crossed. For the third shot, she stopped thinking altogether. Her grandfather's voice again, quiet as wind through the grass. "When everything been calculated, trust what can't be measured." She breathed once, twice, found the gap between heartbeats. And in that stillness, she became the rifle. The trigger broke cleanly. The bullet flew, 3¼ seconds, a lifetime stretched thin over the Georgia air. Then a sound. A bell-like clang rolled across the valley, metallic and pure. The steel plate rocked in its frame. Nobody moved. "Hit confirmed," the spotter whispered. Then louder, "Hit confirmed." Applause didn't come right away. For a moment, disbelief held the crowd still. Then the Australian warrant officer raised a laser rangefinder. His voice trembled slightly. "Laser theodolite confirms 2,743 meters," he said, "accounting for refraction." A record, beyond the rifle's rated capability, beyond what doctrine said was possible. The general exhaled slowly, then softly, "Well, I'll be damned." Kellerman lowered the rifle, face calm, eyes steady. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, then stepped back, letting the others crowd around the instrument table. The range safety officer muttered, That's impossible." "No," the Australian corrected, That's Kellerman. General Hayes walked to her, his voice low. What we just saw, Sergeant, wasn't luck. No, sir, she said quietly. It was math and memory. He studied her for a moment. You've done this before. Not exactly like this, she admitted, but close enough. The general's gaze softened. We'll talk later. As others gathered around the data printouts, she sat on an ammo crate and watched them. The men who'd laughed now stared at her with something like awe, but she didn't feel vindicated. Just tired. All those years in logistics. All those deployments where her rifle skills were a quiet secret, used when needed, forgotten when not. 5 tour. Dozens of nights alone on rooftops, covering convoys that never knew she was there. The ghost of Kandahar. The name had followed her, unwanted, but it was never about the myth. It was about the silence that came after the shot, the silence that felt heavier than sound. Now, as the echoes faded again, she thought of her grandfather's last lesson, the one he'd whispered before he died. The shots that matter most aren't the ones people remember. They're the ones that save someone you'll never meet. She looked downrange one last time, the heat shimmering like memory. Somewhere out there, 2.5 kilometers away, a steel plate still vibrated from a single bullet's truth. And for the first time in years, Staff Sergeant Vera Kellerman allowed herself to breathe. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens after silence breaks history. The clang of steel was still echoing in people's minds long after it had faded from the range. No one wanted to be the first to speak, as if words might somehow ruin the purity of the moment. Then the sound of boots on gravel, cautious, deliberate, signaled the end of disbelief. Technicians rushed forward, setting up high-speed cameras and Doppler tracking systems. General Hayes ordered the entire event logged as a formal demonstration. And amid the quiet chaos, Kellerman simply stood there, brushing a trace of dust from her uniform, as if she'd just finished checking inventory. The Australian instructor, Warrant Officer Thorne, approached her, eyes still sharp but now softened with something she hadn't seen in a long time: respect. "Bloody hell," he muttered under his breath. "They told stories about you, but I didn't think." She cut him off gently. "You weren't supposed to." He nodded. "Yeah, makes sense. Ghosts don't tell their own stories." For a while, neither said anything more. They just stood watching the technicians measure, confirm, argue. Vera didn't need the numbers. She already knew. Her grandfather used to say, "If you doubt the shot after it lands, you never understood it before you took it." But as the minutes stretched on, she felt a strange dissonance inside. That shot, the one that had silenced a room full of warriors, should have felt like vindication. A lifetime of invisibility shattered in 3.25 seconds. Instead, it felt like exposure. General Hayes's voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Everyone listen up." The crowd turned. "What we witnessed today isn't about gender, rank, or role," he said, his tone hard but measured. "It's about capability. Real capability, the kind you can't measure with a checklist." He turned toward Kellerman. "Sergeant, I want you in my office after this. We need to talk." The range erupted in whispers. She gave a crisp nod. "Yes, sir." But beneath that calm, her pulse had quickened. Attention wasn't something she knew how to handle. Recognition was a stranger she didn't trust. By sunset, the symposium was over. The technicians had confirmed the range, 2,743 meters with atmospheric correction. The impossible shot. The general had stayed to oversee the analysis himself, watching every frame of high-speed video like a man unwilling to believe his own eyes. Finally, he stood, silent, and handed the printout to his aide. "File this under Kellerman demonstration. Send a copy to SOCOM and AMU. Make sure it's archived." The aide hesitated. "Sir, you want it public." Hayes looked out at the fading horizon. "No, not yet. Let's see where this goes." She didn't sleep that night. The barracks were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you until even the hum of the AC feels loud. Kellerman lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting to the past she tried not to revisit. 11 years. 11 years of being support. The one who carried cases of ammunition instead of rifles. The one who was told, "You wouldn't understand, it's a shooter's thing." But she did understand. She had lived it, hidden it, used it when she had to. The ghost of Kandahar, that name still stung. The Australians had meant it as respect, but it had made her life harder. The story followed her from base to base, a rumor that refused to die. Commanders would pull her aside for off-the-books Overwatch missions, always unofficial, always uncredited. She didn't care then. She'd only cared about saving lives. But the silence that followed those missions, the way her actions disappeared into paperwork and classified files, that was something else, something that chipped away at her. Now, tonight, after the shot that should have rewritten her story, she found herself wondering if anything had really changed. Was she still the same invisible soldier, just momentarily illuminated by shock? The knock on her door came just after midnight. "Sergeant Kellerman," a voice said softly. "General Hayes requests your presence. Conference room, Building 12. She swung her legs over the bed, pulling on her boots. No hesitation, military reflex. When she entered the conference room, Hayes was already there, along with Master Sergeant Chen and Warrant Officer Thorne. A stack of papers sat on the table, ballistic reports, range readings, video stills. "Sit," Hayes said. She did. The general studied her for a long moment. "You realize what you did today shouldn't have been possible." "Yes, sir," she said, "but physics didn't get the memo." That earned her a brief smile from Thorne. Hayes continued, "We reviewed your record. You were injured during sniper school, torn ACL, reclassified to logistics." "Yes, sir. But you've been active, informally." She hesitated. "I've provided Overwatch support when requested, sir." "Unofficially," Chen said. "Yes, Master Sergeant, for operational security." "Or because they didn't want to rewrite the roster," Thorne muttered. Hayes leaned forward. "You've deployed 5 times, ordered match-grade ammunition for units that didn't officially have snipers." He flipped a tablet around, showing requisition logs. "You were using it yourself, weren't you?" Kellerman didn't answer. "Relax, Sergeant," Hayes said. "You're not in trouble. I'm trying to understand how a logistics NCO just outshot 12 of the Army's best." For the first time that night, she met his eyes. "Because I never stopped training, sir," she said quietly, "even when they told me I wasn't supposed to." The room was silent for a beat. Then Hayes exhaled slowly. "You know, I've seen plenty of shooters who can calculate a perfect firing solution, but very few who can feel the air like you did." He looked down at the report again. "We're reworking the advanced sniper program, doctrine, environmental models, everything. I'd like your input." She blinked. "My input, sir." "You're the only one who saw what our instruments didn't. That inversion layer, the atmospheric displacement, your instinct beat the tech. I want that perspective written into our manuals." It was the first time in years anyone had said they wanted something from her instead of about her. She hesitated, uncertain how to react. Chen spoke next. "General, if I may, we should also consider reinstating her sniper qualification, with a waiver for medical and age." Hayes nodded, already in motion. He stood, extending his hand. "You've done more for this program in a day than most do in a career." She shook it firm, steady, but said nothing. Thorne gave her a small, knowing grin. "Welcome back to the fight, Sergeant, this time officially." The next 6 months were the hardest of her life. Returning to sniper school at 30 wasn't about learning to shoot again. It was about proving she still belonged. The younger candidates respected her skill but whispered behind her back. She's just here because of that one shot. Probably a PR thing. She's not real SOF. But Kellerman didn't argue. She trained, harder than any of them. Injury still haunted her knee. The scar tissue pulled in cold weather, slowed her runs, but discipline was a stronger muscle. Every night she stayed late on the range, working through drills in silence. Breathing, shooting, logging. When others slept, she charted temperature changes, humidity patterns, wind data. She didn't just study ballistics, she memorized nature. By week 10, even the doubters stopped talking. She broke the school's long-range record by 200 meters, then did it again, from prone. When graduation came, General Hayes attended in person. He pinned the sniper tab on her shoulder himself. "Distinguished honor graduate," he said quietly, "and a record setter. You've changed the standard, Sergeant Kellerman." Her salute was sharp, but her expression remained calm. Inside, though, something eased the ache of invisibility, lifting, piece by piece. 2 months later, Hayes asked her to return not as a student but as an instructor. It was poetic, almost cruelly so. Her first class included 3 of the men who'd laughed at her on that day at Fort Moore. When she entered the classroom, they all stood. "Morning, ma'am," one said awkwardly. She smiled faintly. "Morning, gentlemen, let's begin." And for the next 8 weeks, she taught them what her grandfather had taught her, that the best shooters aren't the loudest or the strongest, they're the ones who listen, who see, who wait. One evening after class, one of the same operators approached her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say I was wrong. That day at the rain." She stopped him with a raised hand. "You don't owe me an apology, Sergeant." He hesitated. "Then what do I owe you?" She looked out across the range, where the sun was setting behind the silhouettes of targets. "Respect," she said softly, "not for me, for the silence that comes before the shot." In the years that followed, the Army quietly implemented the Kellerman protocols, environmental instinctive shooting models, human factor training modules, and advanced atmospheric reading methods. Her notes became part of the manual she had once been told she wasn't qualified to read. But Vera herself never talked about the record. When asked, she'd only smile faintly and say, "That wasn't my longest shot." In her desk, in a small wooden box, she kept a handwritten note. 2247 M, Kandahar, 2019. No paperwork, no medal, just a number. Because for her, it wasn't the record that mattered, it was the life it saved. And sometimes, the world only remembers the loudest heroes. But the quiet ones, the ones who never asked to be seen, they're the ones who change it. Why did silence never scare her? Only people did. Even as a child, Vera Kellerman had understood that quiet could hold entire worlds. On her grandfather's ranch in Montana, the world itself seemed to breathe in stillness. Miles of rolling fields, cut through by wind and memory, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of an old barn that had seen more storms than years. She'd grown up with the smell of oil and dust, of gunmetal and rain. To most, it would have been loneliness. To her, it was home. Her grandfather, Eugene Kellerman, was a man of few words, a relic of a time when silence wasn't emptiness but discipline. He fought in Korea as a sniper, though he almost never spoke about it. Only once, when she was 10, did he tell her why. "You spend enough time looking through a scope," he said, cleaning an old Winchester on the porch, "and you start to understand that distance doesn't make you safe from what you see." She didn't understand then, but she remembered. After her parents' car accident, a late-night highway crash that left her an orphan at 8, the ranch had become her refuge. There were no playgrounds, no friends her age, no city lights. Just the land, her grandfather, and the sound of wind over the plains. He taught her to shoot not because he wanted her to be a soldier, but because he wanted her to be calm, to focus. "The rifle doesn't care if you're scared," he'd say. "It only tells the truth you already know." They'd start at dawn. Dew still clung to the grass. He'd set tin cans on fence posts and hand her a .22 rifle that felt almost as tall as she was. Her first attempts were clumsy, her arms shook, her shots wild, but he never raised his voice. "Slow down," he'd whisper. "Find the stillness. Wait for the world to settle, then trust it." By 10, she could hit a coyote at 600 yards. By 15, she could read wind from a mile away, the way grass leaned, the way dust moved across a ridge. But what he really taught her was something invisible: patience. That a true marksman doesn't control the world, they listen to it. Some evenings he'd sit on the porch and tell her stories about men she'd never met. Carlos Hathcock, Chuck Mawhinney, soldiers who had done the impossible not for glory but to protect their brothers. "People think snipers are killers," he said once. "They're not. The good ones, the real ones, they're guardians. They hold their fire until there's no other choice." She would nod, listening, but there was one story he never told, his own. Only after he passed did she find his service rifle, wrapped in an oilcloth beneath his bed. Alongside it, a small photo, two soldiers in Korea standing in the snow. One was her grandfather. The other's face was scratched out. On the back, in faded ink, "Distance means nothing when you remember." She'd never know what it meant. But that sentence lived in her mind, shaping every decision that came after. At 18, she enlisted. Her grandfather had wanted her to go to college, maybe study meteorology. "You already read the wind better than any weatherman," he'd said. But after he died, the ranch felt too empty, too quiet even for her. The Army offered a kind of purpose she understood: order, rhythm, clarity. At basic training, she excelled in marksmanship. It wasn't talent, not really. It was familiarity. Her rifle was just another way to listen. Drill sergeants noticed. She was recommended for sniper school, rare for a woman at the time, but her scores left no argument. Her file read: consistent, methodical, emotionally detached, exceptional environmental awareness. She laughed when she saw that last line. They made it sound like a defect. Sniper school was everything she'd hoped for, and everything that broke her. She loved the solitude of stalking, the mathematics of trajectory, the poetry in precision. She could feel a shot before she took it, not guess, feel. But in week 6, during a low-crawl exercise through uneven terrain, she twisted her knee badly. The ACL tore clean through. The medics said she'd need surgery and at least 6 months of recovery. By the time she could walk again, her slot was gone. Reclassified to logistics. "Maybe next time," her commanding officer had said. There was no next time. From that day forward, she was paperwork. Ammo counts, transport manifests, supply requisitions. But at every base she was assigned to Shank, Lightning, Kandahar. She found a way back to the range. Sometimes alone at night, sometimes with instructors who remembered her scores. One of them, a British sergeant named Kincaid, once said, "You shoot like you're trying to remember something." Maybe she was. Then came Afghanistan. 5 deployments, 5 rotations through the same heat, the same dust, the same questions. She watched others come and go, some alive, some not. Logistics wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive. Bullets, fuel, food. You kept it all moving or the machine stopped. Still, sometimes, someone would ask for her by name. It always happened the same way, quietly. A captain would find her after hours. "We're short one overwatch. You're good with a rifle, right?" No paperwork, no records, just a nod. She never told anyone, never sought recognition. It was easier that way. But then there was that day in 2019. Kandahar. An Australian patrol pinned down on a ridge outside the city. Visibility was near zero, sand and light twisting together. The radio chatter was frantic. a sniper walking rounds toward their position. Vera had been inspecting supply crates when she heard the call come through. The only rifle nearby was an SR-25 borrowed from a coalition marksman. No range finder, no ballistic computer, just wind, instinct, and time. She climbed the observation post ladder and dropped prone. The dust was so thick it made her eyes burn. One shot missed, then another. The third didn't. 2,247 meters. Through wind, through dust, through disbelief. The round hit, the firing stopped. The Australians never forgot. They called her the Ghost, partly in awe, partly in gratitude, but no official report ever mentioned her name. When she returned to base, she went back to her desk. Filed ammunition forms, counted boxes, ate dinner alone. And when the night came, she sat outside the barracks, looking up at the stars she hadn't seen through the sandstorm, wondering if the man she saved even knew she existed. Her grandfather would have smiled. "That's the point," he would have said. "If you did it right, nobody ever will." Years later, sitting in her small quarters at Fort Moore, Vera still thought about that day. The memory came not as pride, but as weight. She made peace with obscurity, or at least she thought she had. Until that morning, when General Hayes had mocked 12 snipers and asked if there were any real sharpshooters in the room. Until she stood up. Until the silence broke. It's strange how moments that define you never arrive with fanfare. They come disguised as small decisions. Stand up or stay quiet, speak or stay hidden. And once you choose, the world shifts, even if only by a fraction. The day she made that 2,743-meter shot wasn't the start of something new. It was the echo of everything that came before: her grandfather's patience, her parents' loss, her invisible years in logistics, and every unrecorded bullet she'd sent into a storm. People saw it as a miracle. She saw it as math, memory, and ghosts. But maybe, just maybe, it was more than that. Maybe it was her way of telling the world she'd been here all along, quietly waiting for the moment that demanded her. And in that single act, she finally understood what her grandfather meant when he said, "The rifle doesn't lie, it just reveals what's already true." That night after the symposium, she sat alone again, same stillness, same silence. But this time, something inside her had changed. She didn't feel invisible anymore. Not because people finally saw her, but because she no longer needed them to. She looked at her hands, steady, scarred, patient, and whispered a quiet promise to the man who taught her everything. "I get it now, Grandpa." Her reflection in the dark window almost smiled. The world doesn't need to know. The shot already spoke. How does silence travel faster than sound? Within 48 hours of Vera Kellerman's impossible shot, word had already spread beyond Fort Moore, not through press releases or reports, but whispers. Whispered in break rooms, on firing ranges, through encrypted chat groups among snipers who never used real names. "Did you hear about the supply NCO? Some woman hit at 2,700 meters. No way, not possible. Ask Thorne, he was there." Each retelling grew a little more blurred, like a photo too many times copied. Some called it luck, others called it divine instinct. But among the ones who truly understood what it meant, those who had stared through glass and seen death flicker at the edge of wind, it was reverence. They didn't care what she looked like or what rank she wore. They cared that she'd done something no one else had. Still, for Vera, nothing seemed different. She returned to her small quarters, same uniform, same coffee, same quiet. If anything, the sudden attention made her uncomfortable. People she barely knew stopped her in hallways, asked what her secret was. Some wanted to shake her hand, others to challenge her. She deflected every question with the same calm line. "I just read the wind." But inside something was stirring, not pride, not satisfaction, but unease. because for all the awe in their eyes, she could see the other thing too, fear. Not of her, but of what she represented, the idea that someone outside the system, someone without the badge or tab or title, could outshoot those who had all three. That kind of truth made people uncomfortable. A week later, she was summoned to a small briefing room on the top floor of the marksmanship facility. When she arrived, General Hayes was already there, seated across from a man she didn't recognize, clean-cut, civilian clothes, a posture that screamed military despite the lack of uniform. "Sergeant Kellerman," Hayes greeted. "This is Mr. Monroe, Defense Advanced Research Group." Monroe nodded politely. "Ma'am." She blinked at the formality. Few ever called her that. Hayes gestured for her to sit. "They've been monitoring our symposium trials. Your demonstration caught their attention." Monroe leaned forward. "We're building a new kind of sniper training pipeline, blending AI atmospheric modeling with human instinct data. But to calibrate it, we need shooters who don't rely on machines. Shooters like you." Kellerman frowned slightly. "You want me to train an AI?" "Not train," Monroe said. "Teach it what you feel. You made a correction no computer could predict. That inversion layer, you didn't just calculate it, you sensed it." She studied him. "And what happens when your program learns that?" He smiled faintly. "Then we'll have an army of Vera Kellermans." She didn't smile back. Hayes interjected gently. "It's voluntary, Sergeant, but it could shape doctrine for years to come." Voluntary. That word always carried hidden strings. Still, she nodded. "I'll consider it, sir." Hayes gave her a long, almost fatherly look. "Just remember, you've already changed something. Whether you join them or not, you've made the Army take a hard look at itself." That night she sat alone in her room, staring at the small wooden box on her desk. Inside it, the note, 2247M, Kandahar 2019. She traced the numbers with her thumb. It wasn't the distance that mattered. It was the silence that followed, the same silence now pressing against her walls. Part of her wanted to say yes, to share what she knew, to make sure her grandfather's lessons didn't die with her. But another part, quieter and deeper, whispered caution. She'd spent her life invisible for a reason. Once you let them see you, they own the story. And Vera Kellerman had learned that stories in uniform rarely belonged to the ones who lived them. 2 days later, she found herself at the edge of the same firing range where it all began. But this time, she wasn't shooting. She was watching. Her new trainees, 3 of the same operators who had once laughed, now stood behind their rifles, sweating under Georgia heat. She gave quiet corrections, nothing more. "Wind's lying to you at 900, she said softly. "Don't trust the mirage, read the grass." They adjusted, fired, missed. She didn't scold, just waited. Again. Second shot missed closer. "Now stop thinking," she said. "Find stillness." The third round rang steel. Their faces lit up, part disbelief, part relief. She smiled faintly. "It's not about control, it's about trust." One of them, Sergeant Mason, lowered his rifle and asked, "Ma'am, how do you know when it's right?" She thought for a moment. "When the world feels quiet," she said, "not silent quiet, there's a difference." He didn't understand yet, but he would. Later that evening, Monroe appeared again, clipboard in hand, watching from the shadows near the bleachers. When the session ended, he approached her. "Still considering my offer?" "Still deciding," she said. He nodded slowly. "You know, Sergeant, the system doesn't like ghosts, it likes names, files, data, people we can track and learn from. You could help shape the next generation." "Or erase the need for one," she said evenly. That caught him off guard. "Technology's supposed to make us better," he countered. "Or replace us when it does," she replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think small, Sergeant. We think in centuries." "Then maybe that's the problem." She walked away, leaving him in silence. That night the dreams came back. Kandahar, the dust, the wind, the smell of hot metal, the Australian corporal pinned down, calling for help, the way her hands didn't shake as she loaded the borrowed rifle. She saw the shot again, the 3 seconds of flight, the impact, the sudden, sacred stillness. Then another image, her grandfather on the porch, smiling faintly. Distance means nothing when you remember. She woke up in the dark, heart steady but eyes wet. A week later, General Hayes called her in again. "I read Monroe's report," he said. "He says you refused the data integration test." "Yes, sir." "Any reason?" She met his gaze. "I don't want to turn instinct into code, sir. Some things should stay human." He nodded slowly. "I agree, but that means you'll be out of their loop. Less visibility, less recognition." She smiled faintly. "That's where I've always been most useful." Hayes leaned back. "You ever wonder why people like you end up buried in the system?" She hesitated. "Because the system doesn't know how to measure silence." That earned her a soft laugh from the general. "Maybe that's why I like you, Sergeant." For months things went back to something resembling normal. Training, reports, range days. But behind the scenes, the ripple of her shot kept spreading. At Fort Bragg, a Special Operations Task Force quietly revised their sniper qualification metrics, citing nonlinear atmospheric factors. At Quantico, instructors began introducing instinctive adjustment drills. Even NATO's marksmanship manual referenced an unnamed U.S. demonstration that had exceeded doctrinal limits through intuitive environmental correction. Her name was never mentioned. She preferred it that way. But sometimes, in quiet moments between lessons, she'd catch herself wondering, had she done the right thing staying silent? Recognition wasn't what she wanted, but visibility could protect others, show young women in uniform that quiet competence was its own kind of strength. She thought of those coming after her, the ones who might never be given a chance to stand up. Maybe her silence wasn't humility anymore. Maybe it was fear. That realization hit harder than recoil. One evening she stayed late on the range. The sky burned orange over the tree line. She set up a rifle alone, the air still except for distant cicadas. No cameras, no officers, no audience. Just her, the wind, and the familiar hum of the world breathing. She adjusted the scope and smiled softly. "For you, Grandpa." The shot cracked across the valley, clean, measured, perfect. The steel rang. She didn't log the distance, didn't need to. Because this one wasn't for records, it was for memory. For every invisible soldier who'd ever done their job so well that nobody noticed. For every moment history forgot to write down. Later that night, sitting on her bunk, she finally opened a small letter Hayes had slipped her earlier that week. Inside was a single line written in his hand. "Sometimes, Sergeant, leadership is knowing when not to take credit." Beneath it a postscript. "Keep doing what you're doing. The world's watching, even if it doesn't admit it yet." She folded the letter, placed it in the box beside her old note. 2247 M, Kandahar 2019. 2 numbers, 2 shots, 2 lives changed. One public, one forgotten. But in the end, they meant the same thing. Proof that silence could still shake the world, if it spoke in the right direction. That night, as the base lights flickered across her room, Vera closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of wind or distance. She dreamed of peace, of her grandfather's porch, of soft laughter, of a world that no longer needed people like her to stay unseen. Until that day came, she would keep teaching, keep guiding, keep the silence alive. Because the truth wasn't in the record books. It was in the space between heartbeat and breath. In the stillness before the shot. How do you say no to a mission you were never supposed to be part of? It began, as it always did, with a quiet knock on her door. It was late, the kind of late where the air itself feels tired. She had been sitting at her desk, oiling her rifle out of habit, not necessity. The range was closed. The night outside was black and endless, heavy with summer humidity. When she opened the door, two men stood in the hallway, one in uniform, one not. Staff Sergeant Kellerman. She nodded. "Ma'am, you're being requested for immediate temporary attachment to Task Force Delta 19. Authorization signed by SOCOM." Her first instinct was confusion. There must be a mistake. I'm not on operational rotation. The civilian, tall, severe, with the kind of face that never smiled, shook his head. "No mistake. They need you for a controlled overwatch scenario. You'll be briefed on the plane." "Plane?" He gestured toward the end of the corridor. "The convoy's waiting. Bring your gear." 30 minutes later, she was airborne in a C-17, the roar of the engines drowning out the chaos in her mind. Nobody spoke much. The team around her, 6 operators, their patches blacked out, avoided eye contact. She recognized their type immediately: quiet, elite, restless. The kind of men who lived for missions that never existed on paper. Across from her sat a familiar face. Warrant Officer Thorne. He gave her a nod. "Didn't think we'd cross paths again, mate." She raised an eyebrow. "If I'm on your flight, something's already gone wrong." That earned a faint smirk. "You're not wrong." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "You're here because the tech failed again. Same problem you spotted at Fort Moore: inversion layers, unpredictable mirage drift. They want a human brain on the scope this time, not a computer." She studied him for a moment. "Where are we going?" "Turkey," he said. "Near the Syrian border. Observation Post Omega. Long-range overwatch for a drone recovery mission. Nothing flashy." Nothing flashy. Those 2 words were always a lie. They landed before dawn. The air was different there, thinner, sharper, the kind that carried distance differently. Omega Base wasn't a base at all, just a camouflaged compound built into a mountainside. Its purpose was simple: keep eyes on a valley that technically didn't exist, where a downed reconnaissance drone sat half-buried among rocks. Officially, the crash site was uninhabited. Unofficially, it was. A local militia had moved in, scavenging the wreckage. The U.S. wanted it back or destroyed. Kellerman's job was to provide overwatch for the extraction team, a job she hadn't done in years. When she arrived at the observation post, a young operator was already setting up the Barrett MRAD. He looked at her skeptically. "You're the shooter." She didn't answer, just adjusted the bipod and checked the elevation knobs. He watched her with a mix of doubt and discomfort, the same look she'd seen 1,000 times. "I heard about that shot," he said finally. "The 2,700-meter one. Some people say it was luck." She met his eyes. "That's because they've never run out of it." He didn't speak again. By afternoon, the operation was live. Thorne handled the comms. The extraction team moved under cover through the canyon below. From her position, Vera had a perfect view: 6 kilometers of terrain, every angle, every movement. But something felt off. The wind pattern was wrong. The forecast said northeast, but the valley air was spiraling counter to the higher layers. It meant her shots, if needed, would curve unpredictably. She adjusted her readings by instinct. "Control, this is Echo 2, she whispered into her mic. "You've got a cross-layer wind anomaly at grid 416. Recommend adjusting ingress route by 50 meters east." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Negative, Echo 2. Satellite data shows clear." She bit her tongue. Satellite data didn't mean much if you couldn't feel the wind. Thorne glanced at her. "They're not listening, are they?" "No," she said quietly, "but they will." Minutes passed, then static, then shouting. Contact, taking fire from the ridge." Kellerman's breath stilled. Through her scope, she saw muzzle flashes, small, erratic, not trained fighters. But the angles were perfect. The team was pinned. Echo 2, eyes on shooters, command barked. Affirmative, she said calmly. 3 targets, ridge line, elevation 12 meters above the crash. Wind 7 left to right, distance 1268. Engage at will. She didn't reply, she didn't need to. Her world narrowed to the glass. First target, slight lean, poor discipline but steady aim. She exhaled. The rifle's recoil felt like memory. Hit. Second shooter ducked, too late. 2 shots, 2 echoes. The ridge went silent. Control, ridge clear, she reported. Thorne's voice came over the channel, calm but tight. Echo 2, we owe you one. She said nothing, because the third shooter wasn't dead. He was running not toward them but away, and he wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying something small, metallic, wrapped in cloth. Through her scope she could see his face. He was barely 20, terrified. Thorne looked over. You see it? Yeah. Could be part of the drone corps. Could be something else. Orders. Stand by. She hesitated, just long enough for doubt to slip through. The voice of control came again. Echo 2, do you have visual on fleeing hostile? Affirmative. Engage. He's carrying sensitive material. Her finger hovered over the trigger. But something in her gut, that same instinct that had saved her life more than once, screamed no. She watched the boy stumble, drop the cloth, and keep running. The object rolled, a small metal tin, not electronics. She magnified. It wasn't part of the drone, it was a locket. She switched channels. Control, negative on engagement, civilian. Repeat, non-combatant. Echo 2, that's not your call, command snapped. Take the shot. Her voice turned to steel. Respectfully, sir, I won't shoot a kid carrying jewelry. Static. Then silence. Thorne's eyes widened slightly. You just refused a direct order. She exhaled slowly. Yeah, I did. The mission ended without further shots. The extraction succeeded. The drone core was recovered. The report read, minor engagement, no casualties. But back at Omega Base, the debrief was colder. A colonel from command flew in, eyes like polished glass. Staff Sergeant, he said flatly, do you understand the gravity of disobeying an engagement order? Yes, sir. Why did you refuse? Because he wasn't a threat. That's not for you to decide. She met his gaze. Then maybe it should be. The colonel's jaw tightened. You've made yourself a liability. Thorne interrupted. With respect, sir, she saved 6 lives today. By ignoring a lawful command, the colonel snapped. Vera's voice stayed calm. I followed the only rule that mattered. Don't shoot what you don't understand. The colonel stared at her, then turned to Thorne. Get her off my range, she's done. The next day, as the team packed up to leave, Thorne found her sitting outside, staring at the valley. You knew the risk, he said quietly. She nodded, yeah. You could have taken the shot, and no one would have questioned it. I would have. He looked out across the canyon. That's the curse, isn't it? Having a conscience in a world that rewards obedience. She gave a tired smile. You sound like my grandfather. He chuckled softly. Smart man then. They sat in silence for a while, the mountains around them vast and still. Finally she said, do you think it ever ends? What? Having to prove that doing the right thing isn't weakness. Thorne didn't answer right away. Then, no, but maybe people like you make it easier for the rest of us. Back at Fort Moore, the fallout came quickly. A formal reprimand for failure to comply with engagement protocol. Removal from operational assignment. Hayes called her into his office. I can't protect you from this one, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to. You did the right thing, Vera. I know. He leaned forward, and that's what scares them. That night, as she cleaned her rifle for the last time in months, she thought about the boy, the one who ran. She pictured his face, the way his eyes looked more confused than angry. Maybe he'd survived, maybe not. She would never know. But she did know this. Sometimes the hardest part of pulling the trigger is knowing when not to. Her grandfather's voice returned again, soft as ever. Patience isn't about waiting, kid. It's about choosing when not to act. She smiled faintly. I finally understand, Grandpa. She looked out her window at the dark sky, calm, endless, unknowable, and whispered to herself, almost as a prayer. Sometimes, the shot that matters most is the one you never take. What happens to a soldier who refuses to obey, not out of fear but conviction? The answer, as Vera Kellerman learned, isn't written anywhere. The investigation began 3 days after she returned stateside. It didn't come with cuffs or headlines, just paperwork, briefings, and the dull ache of waiting. They called it a command compliance review, but everyone knew what it was, a test. The kind you can't study for. In the sterile gray of the administrative building, she sat across from a panel of officers. Their faces were polite masks, detached, procedural, unreadable. A colonel read from the report. Staff Sergeant Vera Kellerman, during Operation Omega, did knowingly disregard a direct order to engage a hostile target believed to be in possession of sensitive material. The subject asserts the target was non-combatant. He looked up. Is this statement accurate? Yes, sir. Did you confirm non-combatant status? No, sir. I assessed based on visual observation and pattern of behavior. So a judgment call? Yes, sir. He leaned back, almost tired. Judgment calls get people killed, Sergeant. She met his gaze steady. So does blind obedience. The room went quiet. Another officer, a younger major with kind eyes, spoke next. Did you understand the order was lawful? Yes, sir. And you chose to disobey. I chose not to kill someone who wasn't a threat. The colonel sighed. Sergeant, you don't get to decide what's a threat. She nodded slowly. That's the problem, sir. They dismissed her for the day. No verdict, no closure, just silence, heavy, shapeless silence that followed her down the hallway like shadow. Outside, the sun was setting, streaks of orange and red burning across the Georgia sky. She sat on a concrete bench, hands clasped, watching the light fade. Thorne found her there an hour later. He dropped down beside her with a grunt, tossing a brown envelope onto her lap. From Hayes, he said, says it's personal. She opened it carefully. Inside, a single page. Sometimes truth costs rank, sometimes it earns it. Stay steady. No signature, just the faint smell of coffee and gun oil that always lingered around the general. She smiled faintly. Still no verdict? Thorne asked. Not yet. He nodded, pulling out a cigarette. You know, most folks who cross command don't get hearings. They get silence. The fact they're even asking means someone upstairs is paying attention. I didn't want attention, she said. Yeah, he exhaled smoke. That's what makes you dangerous. 2 weeks later, the verdict came down. Administrative reprimand, no court-martial. Officially, she was counseled for insubordination. Unofficially, she was marked, the kind of mark that doesn't fade, just hides in personnel files and sideways glances. Her operational clearance was suspended. She was reassigned to the Marksmanship Doctrine Division, a polite way of saying, we don't know what to do with you, but we can't let you go either. Most would have seen it as punishment. Vera saw something else. Maybe this was where she could do the most good. The building was tucked behind Fort Moore's main range, quiet, forgotten, just the way she liked it. Rows of cubicles filled with officers drafting manuals, revising range protocols, writing about combat they'd never seen. She was given an empty office, a blank whiteboard and an instruction. Help us improve human factors training in sniper operations. It was ironic. They wanted her to teach the thing she'd been reprimanded for: judgment. So she did. But she didn't write doctrine, she wrote stories. Anonymous case studies, each describing moral decisions under fire. No names, no units, just choices. One read: Shooter identifies a target carrying an object. Target flees. Orders given to engage. Shooter hesitates, identifies object as personal item, refuses. Target later confirmed non-combatant. What is the cost of hesitation? She didn't provide an answer. She let the students argue. At first, the instructors resisted. "We're not philosophers, Kellerman," one said. "No," she replied softly, "but we make decisions that end lives. Maybe we should act like it matters." Slowly, something changed. Her classes filled. Students stayed late. They didn't come to learn math or marksmanship. They came for something rarer: permission to think. She'd start each session with the same line: "Anyone can pull a trigger. Few can live with what happens after." Then she'd tell them about wind, about how every decision, like every gust, changes what happens downrange. How sometimes missing the shot isn't failure, it's grace. She never mentioned Omega, never said Kandahar. She didn't have to. The truth was in her eyes. One afternoon, while reviewing field manuals, she heard a knock. "Come in." It was the major from her hearing panel, the one with the kind eyes. He looked around the sparse office. "Still keeping it simple, I see." "Complicated things break easily," she said. He smiled. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead." He hesitated, then placed a folder on her desk. "There's talk of creating a new ethics component for the advanced sniper curriculum. Something beyond ballistics, human decision-making, moral restraint, empathy under pressure. Command wants you to design it." She stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." She leaned back slowly. "So the Army wants a course on conscience." He shrugged. "It seems we could use one." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "I'll do it." Weeks turned into months. The course grew from notes on a board to an entire framework. She named it Decision Integrity Training, simple, unpretentious. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about awareness. Situational, emotional, ethical. She taught them that instinct isn't guesswork. It's the sum of experience, empathy, and consequence. During simulations, she'd pause the footage mid-shot. "What's happening in this moment?" she asked. "Not what you see, what you feel." Some hated it. "Feelings don't win wars," one student muttered. She looked at him evenly. "Neither does ignorance." The reports came in quietly. Graduates from her program performed better in high-pressure environments. Fewer misfires, fewer civilian casualties, higher mission trust. But what mattered to Vera wasn't numbers. It was letters. One day she found an envelope on her desk, no sender, no rank. Inside, a single line written in pencil. "I stopped a shot today because of what you said. He turned out to be a kid." No signature. She read it 3 times, then folded it into her notebook. That night she walked to the range alone. The air was cold. The moon hung like a silver coin above the pine trees. She lay prone, rifle steady, and whispered to the wind, "This one's for all the shots we didn't take." Months later, she was invited to Washington for a closed symposium. She didn't want to go, didn't like the ceremony, the flash, but Hayes insisted. When she entered the conference room, she froze. Across the table sat generals, senators, contractors, but at the head her old colonel, the one who'd called her a liability. He smiled thinly. "Staff Sergeant, congratulations. Your course has reduced incident rates across SOCOM by 12%. Command wants to expand it Army-wide." She nodded. "That's good news." He continued, "And we're recommending you for promotion Sergeant First Class, pending review." Applause followed. She didn't smile. When it quieted, she asked, "Why now?" He hesitated, "Because results matter." She held his gaze, "And conscience." He blinked, "What about it?" "It matters too, sir." The room went still. Then Hayes chuckled softly, breaking the tension. "It does, Sergeant. It always has. We just needed someone brave enough to remind us." After the meeting, Hayes caught up with her in the hallway. "You handled that well," he said. "I wasn't trying to. That's why it worked." He smiled, then handed her a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "Your next assignment, voluntary of course." She opened it. Inside, coordinates. A remote training site in Arizona. "Another course." Hayes nodded. "This time not for soldiers, for allies. International training exchange. They requested you specifically." "Who?" He grinned. "Australians. Word gets around." For the first time in years, she laughed. That night she packed in silence. Each movement deliberate, practiced, the ritual of someone who'd lived between duty and purpose for too long. Before she left, she placed two things in her rucksack: the letter from the unknown soldier and the note that never left her desk. 2247 M, Kandahar 2019. Both reminders, both reasons. When the sun rose over Fort Moore, Vera Kellerman walked out of the barracks for what might have been the last time. No ceremony, no salute, just the sound of gravel under her boots. The kind of exit only a ghost could make. As the plane lifted into the dawn, she watched the clouds drift beneath her, slow, weightless, infinite. She thought of every lesson she'd ever learned, every silence that had defined her. The world measured shots by distance. She measured them by meaning. And in that simple equation she'd found peace. Not the peace of victory, but of understanding. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't come from being right. It comes from staying human. How do you teach peace to people trained for war? The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, pale gold by day, blood red by dusk. The Arizona training site wasn't a base so much as a skeleton of one. A few prefabricated buildings, a half-buried range, and a communications tower that hummed like a nervous thought. For most soldiers, this place felt empty. For Vera Kellerman, it felt alive. The air here was thin and honest. No politics, no hierarchy, just wind and distance. She'd been here a week now, working quietly with a group of allied snipers and instructors, men and women from Australia, Canada, the UK, and a few other nations that preferred not to be named. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even official, but it mattered. And that was enough. The first morning she met her class, they didn't know what to make of her. The Australian sergeant, young, square-jawed, full of the kind of confidence that hadn't yet met humility, glanced at her name tag and smirked. "Ma'am, are you the one they call the ghost?" She paused, setting her rifle case down. "That's what they used to call me," she said quietly. "Now I prefer Vera." He grinned, clearly expecting a story. She didn't offer one. Instead, she began class with a question that caught them all off guard. "What's the most dangerous thing in a sniper's world?" A hand shot up. "Enemy fire." "No." "Another bad intel." "No." "Wind." She smiled faintly. "Close, but no." They looked at her, confused. "The most dangerous thing," she said softly, "is certainty." Over the next few days, she trained them the way her grandfather had trained her, quietly, patiently, without ego. She taught them how to read mirage, not just measure it, how to feel humidity through breath, how to see wind not as an obstacle but a rhythm. She showed them how silence could be a tool, how stillness could command respect. But what made her different wasn't the science. It was the humanity she threaded through every lesson. You'll all face moments when the shot feels clear, she told them one evening, and you'll tell yourself it's the right one, but sometimes clarity is the loudest lie. They didn't understand at first. They would. By the second week, she began to notice one student in particular, Corporal Elias Monroe, a 24-year-old with sharp reflexes and haunted eyes. He was quiet, focused, almost too perfect in form, but there was a heaviness to him, the kind that doesn't come from exhaustion but from memory. During drills, he performed flawlessly, but during simulations, the moral scenarios she designed, he always chose aggression, quick decisions, no hesitation. After one exercise, she pulled him aside. "You're fast," she said, "too fast." He frowned. "Isn't that what we're trained for, ma'am? Quick reaction time." She studied him. "Reaction isn't the same as understanding." He shrugged, looking away. "In my experience, hesitation gets people killed." Her voice softened, "And shooting the wrong person does." He didn't answer, just nodded stiffly and walked off. Something in her chest tightened. That look in his eyes, she'd seen it before. That night, as the desert cooled, she sat outside the barracks, cleaning her rifle beneath a pale moon. The air smelled like dust and sage. Footsteps approached. "Permission to join you, ma'am." "Elias?" She nodded, wordless. He sat beside her, the quiet stretching between them until he broke it. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "That story, the one about the sniper who refused to take a shot, the one you use in class, it's real, isn't it?" She paused, keeping her hand steady. "Why do you think that?" "Because you talk like you were there." She looked up at him. The firelight from the barracks flickered across his face, young but already worn. "Yeah," she said quietly, "I was there." He studied her carefully. "You don't regret it?" She shook her head. "No, not for a second." But what if they'd been wrong? What if that kid had been carrying something dangerous? "Then I'd live with it," she said, "but I'd also live with myself." He frowned. "I don't know if I could make that call." "You will," she said softly. "One day you'll face something that forces you to choose what kind of person you are, not what kind of soldier." He didn't respond, just nodded slowly, lost in thought. When he left, she sat there a long time, staring at the stars, feeling a familiar ache. The next morning, the training shifted to a live-fire range carved into a canyon. The terrain looked eerily familiar: wind channels, rocky ledges, sun flares dancing off the horizon. It reminded her of Kandahar. She tried not to think about it. But then, halfway through the session, Elias froze mid-shot. His breathing went ragged. "Corporal," she called, "you all right?" He didn't answer. His scope trembled. She moved closer. "What's wrong?" He exhaled shakily. "It's stupid, ma'am, just I had a flashback." "To what?" He hesitated. Then softly, "A mission, my first. Northern Syria 2021. I was on Overwatch, saw movement. Young guy running with something metal in his hands, got the order to shoot. I didn't hesitate." He swallowed. "It wasn't a weapon, it was a locket." Her blood went cold. He continued, voice barely above a whisper. "When I went down there after, he couldn't have been older than 20. Locals said he was trying to get his sister's pendant out of the rubble." The world tilted slightly around her. She forced her voice steady. "What did you say your name was again?" "Elias Monroe, ma'am." She nodded faintly, hiding the tremor in her hands. The name hit her like recoil. Monroe. She remembered the operation file from Omega, the civilian analyst who'd relayed their coordinates, the same last name. She didn't know if it was coincidence. She didn't ask. But in that moment, she understood something her grandfather had told her once. "You don't always save people with your trigger, Vera. Sometimes you save them by not taking the shot." And maybe, just maybe, the boy she hadn't shot that day had grown up, had lived, had a brother who was now sitting right beside her. That night she sat alone on the range, staring into the dark. The air was still. She whispered into the emptiness, "You made it, didn't you?" A gust of wind passed over her, gentle, warm like breath. She smiled faintly, tears catching the starlight. The next day, she changed the lesson plan. No rifles, no targets, just talk. They sat in a circle beneath the training awning, the desert sun soft behind them. "I want to tell you a story," she said. They leaned in. "It's about a soldier who learned that distance doesn't make you safe from what you see. That the hardest part of being a sniper isn't taking the shot, it's living with the ones you don't." She told them about patience, about empathy, about reading people the way they read wind. And when she finished, she looked at Elias. He met her eyes, silent, understanding. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the measure of a marksman isn't how far they can shoot, it's how close they can feel." Weeks passed. Her students graduated, confident, calmer, different. Elias approached her on the final day, envelope in hand. "This is for you, ma'am." She opened it after he walked away. Inside was a photo, a boy standing beside a small, burned-out village, smiling, dusty, alive. On the back, written in pencil, "He survived. I found out after, thank you." She sat there for a long time, eyes closed, the desert wind moving softly around her. That evening, she packed her things. Before leaving, she walked to the range one last time. The horizon was painted in the same colors she'd seen in Kandahar, gold fading to red, sky folding into shadow. She set her rifle down but didn't fire. She just whispered a quiet prayer. "For all the ghosts who found peace," she said, "and for the ones still learning to." When she flew home, she didn't return to Fort Moore. She didn't go back to teaching. She took leave first in years and returned to Montana. The ranch was smaller now, fenced off and overgrown, but the porch still stood. The same boards her grandfather had sat on, the same horizon he'd taught her to read. She unpacked a small case, assembled her old Winchester, and rested it across her knees. The air smelled like rain and memory. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely still. As the sun disappeared, she whispered to the open sky, "Grandpa, you were right. Distance doesn't make you safe from what you see, but sometimes it gives you the space to understand it." A breeze moved through the grass, gentle, approving. She smiled, because she knew now she hadn't just trained soldiers. She'd trained something deeper. Conscience. And maybe that was the legacy that mattered most. That night she opened her journal, the one she rarely showed anyone, and wrote 3 lines. "Sometimes silence teaches louder than orders. Sometimes mercy shoots straighter than pride. And sometimes ghosts don't haunt, they guide." She closed the book, placed it beside her rifle, and watched the stars rise. For the first time the world felt quiet, not heavy, not lonely, but full. The kind of quiet she'd been chasing her whole life. And in that silence she realized she wasn't invisible anymore. She had simply become part of the stillness itself. How does a story end when the world never knew it began? For Vera Kellerman, there were no medals waiting, no speeches, no flags folded in honor. Just morning light spilling across the Montana hills, the same hills where she first learned to listen. It had been a year since she'd left the army. The official letter had arrived quietly, as she expected it would. Honorable discharge, voluntary separation. A line of text closing 2 decades of service. She'd read it once, smiled faintly, and set it aside. Because she knew she hadn't left the army, she left the noise. Her days fell into rhythm now. She woke before sunrise, brewed coffee in an old tin pot, and watched the horizon shift colors like a slow heartbeat. Then she'd walk the fence line, boots crunching over frost, hands buried in her jacket pockets. Sometimes she carried her rifle, sometimes she didn't. The act of holding it still felt holy, but not because of the weapon itself. It was the silence it demanded, the discipline of being present. Out here there were no orders, no ranks, no witnesses. Only her, the land, and the sound of her own breath. People from town came by sometimes. A few local kids, young hunters, veterans who'd heard rumors. They'd find her on the porch and ask if she'd really made that shot. She always gave the same answer, which one? They'd laugh, assuming she was joking. She was, because the shots that mattered to her weren't measured in meters. They were measured in mercy. One afternoon, as she was cleaning her old Winchester, a pickup truck pulled into the dirt road. She recognized the uniform before the man even stepped out. Warrant Officer Thorne. Older now, his hair gone to gray, his eyes still carrying that desert sharpness. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, smiling. She stood, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You get lost." "Always," he said, stepping onto the porch. He handed her a small envelope, the paper worn and creased. "Came through channels. Figured you'd rather I bring it than some courier." She raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Not sure. Classified enough to make me curious." Inside was a letter typed unsigned. Staff Sergeant Vera Kellerman, Ret. Your work in ethical engagement doctrine has been incorporated into the updated Joint Marksmanship Manual. Effective immediately, all U.S. and Allied sniper programs will include decision integrity training as a required module. Your material remains unattributed per your original request. Below it, a single sentence in pen, written by hand. Sometime, the quietest revolutions are the loudest ones. She read it twice, then folded it carefully. Thorne chuckled. "Guess the ghost just changed military law." She smiled, didn't mean to. "That's what makes it stick." They sat on the porch for hours, sharing stories, some true, some softened by time. When the sun began to dip, he looked at her rifle leaning by the door. "You ever shoot any more?" "Sometimes," she said, "when the world feels too loud." He nodded. "And does it help?" "Always." They sat in silence after that, the air cooling around them, the sky bleeding into violet. Before he left, Thorne said, "You know, there's a new generation of shooters out there quoting you." "Quoting me?" she laughed. "I've never said anything worth repeating." He smiled. "You'd be surprised." He handed her a small notebook, its cover filled with signatures from soldiers, men and women she'd never met. On the first page, one line stood out. "Sometimes the shot that matters most is the one you don't take. VK." Her throat tightened. "I didn't write that down." "No," he said, "but you lived it, that's enough." After Thorne left, she sat outside until the stars came. The air smelled of pine and rain. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She reached for her rifle, not to shoot, just to feel its weight, the familiar balance that had once steadied her in chaos. She loaded a single round, aimed at nothing, and whispered. For every unseen hand that held steady, for every heart that hesitated when it mattered. Then she unloaded it again. The rifle never fired. It didn't need to. Days passed, weeks blurred into one another. And then one morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, international postmark. Inside was a photograph of a classroom. Dozens of young recruits in desert camouflage, all holding notebooks stamped with her course emblem, Decision Integrity Training. On the back of the photo, a short message in careful script. "You don't know us, but you changed us. Thank you." No signature, no rank. She pinned the photo to her wall. It hung there beside two other things, her grandfather's photo from Korea and the note that had followed her everywhere. 2247 M, Kandahar 2019. 3 reminders. Her origin, her choice, her legacy. That night a storm rolled over the plains, thunder low and distant, like artillery softened by time. She watched lightning bloom along the ridges, remembering the night sky over Afghanistan, the flashes that weren't weather back then. She wondered how many of those young soldiers had stood in storms like this, waiting for orders that never came. She whispered into the thunder, "May they learn faster than we did." When morning came, the air was fresh, the horizon washed clean. She brewed her coffee and stepped outside. The world glowed gold again, soft, forgiving, alive. And there, standing at the end of her driveway, was a familiar figure. Elias Monroe. Older, more grounded, civilian clothes, eyes steady. She walked toward him, surprised but not startled. "Didn't expect to see you again," she said. He smiled faintly. "Didn't expect to be here." They stood for a moment quiet. He pulled something from his jacket, a small, weathered locket. "My brother wanted me to give you this," he said. She froze. "Your brother?" He nodded. "The one from Syria, the one you didn't shoot." Her heart stilled. "He's alive," she whispered. He smiled. "Very. Runs a medical clinic in Jordan now. Says he owes his life to someone who trusted her gut more than her orders." She didn't know what to say. Her throat closed. He placed the locket in her hand. "He told me to tell you this sometimes. Not firing is the bravest thing anyone can do." She looked down at the small piece of metal, scarred, dented, but whole. A simple pendant with a photo of a young girl inside. She swallowed hard, tears cutting through the dust on her face. "Tell him," she began, voice trembling. "Tell him I'm glad he kept something worth running for." Elias nodded, eyes wet too. "I already did." After he left, she sat on the porch, the locket resting in her palm. She opened it once more, studying the faded picture. Then she looked out at the horizon, endless, peaceful, vast, and smiled through tears. Her grandfather's words echoed softly in her mind. "The best shooters are invisible until the moment demands otherwise." She had lived invisible, and when the moment demanded, she had acted. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for dignity. That evening, as the sun sank low, she wrote one final entry in her journal, the last she would ever need. "The world will remember the records, the numbers, the distances. But the truth lives in the quiet between them. I was never the best shot. I was just the one who listened longest before pulling the trigger." She closed the book and set it beside her rifle, the two resting together like old friends. The wind moved through the grass, gentle, constant, a sound like breathing. And for the first time in her life, Vera Kellerman felt free. Not invisible, not forgotten. Just complete. The last light touched her face, soft and golden. Somewhere in the distance, a steel plate still waited on a forgotten range, marked by a single, perfect impact. Proof that a bullet could travel almost 3 kilometers. But her true shot, the one that mattered most, would never make the record books. It had traveled through silence, through restraint, through mercy. And it had landed here, in the stillness of an ordinary woman's peace. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.